I think you're still talking about microstructure in solidification.
Yes, we'll go down in scale a little bit. Can you see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Okay.
So please go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much to all the organizers for the kind invitation. So we're going to go down in scale a little bit and look at the formation of microstructure, but more at the intergranular scale, the dendritic structure or cellular structure that forms. So a bit of a disclaimer before we start. I do not consider myself a additive manufacturing expert. Actually, these are some activities that we started a couple of years ago. So a lot of the work that I'm going to present is more of an overview of the field, and then I'll get into what we're currently doing and the things that are getting started. But we're still at the point of getting the tools ready to actually get into interrogating how these microstructures form at the scale of the melt pool, let's say. So the outline of my talk will be like so. I will introduce very briefly the context and motivation, because I think that the audience today and yesterday and the day before is very aware of those challenges. I'll talk a little bit about rapid solidification. I'll kind of piggyback on what Charles was saying and ask, what is rapid solidification? Is additive manufacturing rapid solidification? And how are people modeling these type of things? And then I'll get into some, a kind of an overview of what people have been doing, the state of the art in multi-scale modeling strategies for additive manufacturing at this length scale. And as a case study, I'll show you the work in progress that we have in the framework of this project that you have acknowledged on the right, and all this group of people that have been working on that. In particular, one postdoc and one PhD student, Ruhollah Tavakoli and Mohamed Elahi, that probably should be in the audience. So that's what we're going to talk about. Let me go very briefly on the introduction. So that's, I'm going to throw at you the couple of slides that I show everyone. So for some of you, it will be absolutely obvious that microstructure matters. And let me take this one example of a 316L steel that is processed 3 different ways. So this is studied by the folks at Los Alamos that actually take a rod, 316 stainless steel, one that is additively manufactured, and one that is additively manufactured plus recrystallized. Well, you end up with fairly different microstructure, right? The grain texture, the grain structure is very different, including in the additively manufactured one, you're introducing some intermediate length scale in between the scale of the dendrite, the scale of the grain, the scale of the part that you already have. You're introducing an additional length scale right in the middle, that's that of the melt pool. And then the recrystallized one has even another structure. Well, different structure means different properties. So when you do your stress strain curve, you end up with different properties. And here, interestingly, the additively manufactured one is the one that shows the highest strength. And then when you assess the performance, well, when you're at Los Alamos, you do impact testing of these samples. You see that the response in terms of cracking is very different. So the message here is quite simple, is because you have a 316L, because you have an Inconel 718, because you have a TI64, doesn't mean that you know the properties and the performance and the fatigue life of your alloy. Processing matters because it leads to completely different microstructure. Okay, I think I don't need to insist on that because the audience today is already very much aware of that. Now let me go into what scales matter if you want to model this type of microstructures, this type of grain structure. Well, the scales that matter, unfortunately, and fortunately, because there's challenges too in there, and we like challenges in science, all scales matter. Like in most structural alloys, it starts at the scale of the atom, that, you know, you have your crystal liquid interface, and then the dendrite growth direction will be given by the anisotropy of this crystal liquid interface. Then you have to worry about the interface pattern that will form, you know, complex morphology such as dendrites, and you can have this planar restabilization for high solidification rate and so on. You have the scale of the dendritic arrays, the scale of the grains, and then you go all the way up to the grain structure and the process. And all these scales are actually intertwined, and all of them matter. So the scale that I'm going to be focusing on today, more specifically, is that of the interface pattern and that of the grain. So sensibly smaller than what Charles-André was talking about previously. So of course, if we want to see the dendrite, the segregation pattern between the dendrites and so on, we have to make some assumption. We have to have a finer discretization, and then in terms of length and time scale that we can achieve, we're going to be a little more reduced. And the objective is to see whether we can predict microstructural features, like I said, like dendritic spacings, like segregation, intergranular and in between the grains too, for polycrystalline solidification in conditions relevant to additive manufacturing. And when I say additive manufacturing, most of the time I talk about powder bed laser melting. And at the scale of the melt pool, which may not seem challenging, but when we'll get into length scale and seeing what scale we need to model, it is. So let's dive first, before I talk about modeling of AM per se. Let me talk about rapid solidification. What is rapid solidification? Is AM rapid solidification, and how is it modeled? So what can be a good definition of rapid solidification? Well, you could consider that if you're cooling the liquid really, really fast, it has to be rapid solidification, right? Well, it's qualitative, let's say, to say the least. Let's see if we want to have more quantitative criteria for what rapid solidification is, and what are the phenomenon that allow you to say this is rapid solidification. So the presence of kinetic undercooling, so the temperature difference between your interface temperature and its equilibrium, let's say, given by the phase diagram at the nominal concentration, will have a solutal component, a curvature-related component, and a kinetic component. So the solutal component is just due to gradient of solute that's developed. The curvature is just due to the curvature of your interface, local curvature of your interface, for instance, at the dendrite tip, which is leading the growth of the front, and one term related to velocity, right? And this is the kinetic undercooling. So like Charles-André has shown already, your phase diagram will go down as you increase the velocity. And how do we know that exists? Well, we look at experiments, for instance, on deeply undercooled droplets in levitation, and we see that in order to fix the theory, we need to include, to fix the theory versus experiment, we need to include the contribution of this kinetic coefficient. Another effect that also has been mentioned by Charles-André is solute trapping. When your solidus and liquidus line are getting together, they merge somewhat, your partition coefficient tends to 1. And this is modeled classically with this model. There are others out there, but that's by far the most used by Mike Aziz, where you see that as a function of the velocity, and more precisely as a function of a ratio between the velocity of the interface and the diffusion velocity of the solute through the interface. That's a little bit of an obscure concept, but there are in the literature some definitions of how you can estimate it, or often it's just estimated as the diffusivity over the width of your interface, so a few atomic planes, right? And here you see that when the velocity goes to low values, when it's negligible versus this VD, you get your equilibrium partition coefficient. And when it gets very high, this tends to 1. And this is something that manifests itself in experiments as looking at the partition coefficient versus interface velocity. And you see here those experiments that are, everyone used for their validation on arsenic silicon alloy, or silicon arsenic alloy more precisely, where you see that the partition coefficient actually increases with the velocity of your interface. Well, jointly with that of the partition coefficient, think about the phase diagram and the 2 lines that are actually merging. You have a change of the liquidus slope, and there are also theories that actually describe how this liquidus slope changes with the velocity. Not entering into the details here. So solute trapping, that's another ingredient of rapid solidification. And then the last one would be solid liquid morphological stability. And when I say stability, I mean the stabilization of a planar front. So you know that when you're at low velocity, you have a plane, right? Planar solid liquid interface, or spherical if you're in, a globular or spherical coordinate if you're a modeler. And if you go higher, in velocity, you start having cells, dendrites, but then as you go higher and higher in velocity, you're going to restabilize your planar front. And there are theories out there. The most widespread one is that of Munin-Sekerka for this V minus, that is the low limit of stability, so below your planar, and this V, what I call V plus, that is the absolute stability limit, the velocity above which you restabilize an interface. Planar interface. Okay, and how does it manifest itself in experiments? Well, you have these experiments from Wilfried Kurz and his group back then at EPFL that show banded microstructures in peritectic and eutectic alloys, and more recently in this dynamic TEM microstructures, you can see this banded microstructure, and the bending is due to the stabilization as a planar interface and then destabilization. There's like a cycle of oscillation there that goes on between planar and non-planar. Okay, so these are criteria that are, linked, but not exactly the same that you can use to define what is rapid solidification. All right, is additive manufacturing rapid solidification? So spoiler alert, I don't have an answer for you there, but let's look at niobium into an Inconel 718, right? Let's make a quick back of the envelope calculation. You go to the literature and you get some of the values you need for the parameters, right? And they're mostly orders of magnitude. Some of them we can calculate with thermocalc. We put an Inconel 718 composition at the liquidus temperature, and we look at how much niobium segregates. Okay, that's an approximation, but we get the values we need to calculate this VD that tells you at which velocity will solute trapping start being noticeable, right? It's not when you are completely non-partitioning, but it starts mattering, let's say at 0.8 meter per second. And if you calculate the absolute stability limit using the equilibrium coefficients in the Munin-Sekerka analysis, you get 2 meters per second. If you do a little more accurate calculation of where this will happen, I'm not getting into the details, but you get that the velocity is actually slightly higher. It's somewhere between 2 and 3-4 meters per second, depending if you take into account solute drag, which is a bit of an obscure concept that is not consensual at this point, let's say. So is additive manufacturing rapid solidification? Before I give a half answer to that, of course, what we did here is a binary approximation, back of the envelope calculation, but I think the orders of magnitude still hold. And of course, if you want to have a look at real alloys that are very rarely binaries, you can go have a look, for instance, at those 2 papers that treat this topic of, say, planar destabilization for multi-components. And my answer is additive manufacturing rapid solidification? Yes, no, perhaps, sometimes. So typical velocity in additive manufacturing, they're the order of half to a meter per second, as far as I know. And this is only if you consider the velocity at the tail of the melt pool. It's much lower than that along the melt pool. So is it rapid solidification? Somewhat, I guess. So I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer for you here. But that was the message on rapid solidification. So how are people modeling the formation of microstructure with rapid solidification? Well, I'm going to focus on phase field, because why phase field? Because it's a very powerful model to study morphologically complex patterns such as cells or dendrites. You don't have, assumptions on the shape. So you can form dendrites that are, forming spontaneously. It is based, and I'm going very quickly on that. I'm not showing any phase field equations here, but in traditional thermodynamics, you describe the state of the system and its equilibrium by a system of thermodynamic variable. In Landau mean field theory, you introduce an order parameter that is treated as an additional variable to distinguish between phase. And then you make a diffuse interface formulation of your problem. You're introducing a phase field here, phi. So you see here in this little schematic, in a sharp interface world, this would be +1 in the solid, -1 in the liquid, and 0 at the interface. And you actually make this diffuse, over a length W, the diffuse width of your interface. That would actually represent the number of atomic layers that you need to go from a crystalline ordered phase to a liquid. And then you derive a free energy functional using a Ginzburg-Landau formulation. And the dynamical evolution of the system is given by the free energy functional derivatives. So that's as far as we need to know today about phase field. However, it has a computational cost, and I'll get back to that cost later on, because of course it scales, the cost scales with the scale of what you want to model. Is phase field capable of modeling rapid solidification quantitatively? Well, yes. So that's a good, and it's a good news, because you look, for instance, at those papers from the late 90s, and you find very nice behavior with respect to partitioning, with respect to the undercooling versus velocity. But there's a but, is that such models like this one or a few other ones in the literature can model rapid solidification if your actual diffuse interface width is the actual width of the interface. So a few atomic planes, we're talking a sub-nanometer scale here. So is there a way to upscale phase field simulation to be able to get our diffuse interface larger? Yes, there is, but so far it's been developed only for moderate solidification rate, where you can consider that solid-liquid interface is at equilibrium. So you have this thin interface asymptotic analysis. There's a lot of math to see how much you deviate when you widen your interface, and you have to add this anti-trapping current, because solute trapping, as a matter of fact, is a question of time scale for the solute to go through the interface, to escape the interface, and the time scale of the interface advancing. And when you coarsen your interface numerically, you actually promote solute trapping, but fake numerically induced solute trapping, so you have to correct that. And such type of models can model very well quantitatively some experiments, including kinetic undercooling. So no solute trapping here, but for kinetics, for instance, this is a comparison with these deeply undercooled droplet experiments, can do a good job. But such treatment with the thin interface asymptotics and models that we can consider quantitative are still, remain to be done for multi-component and for rapid solidification and for non-dilute alloys. So that's one of the big challenges in this modeling for the future. So what are actually people using if we don't have quantitative models rigorously with no fitting parameters, what type of model can we use to do rapid solidification? You have some models that actually extrapolate from this quantitative phase field model with, you know, equilibrium interface conditions with, for instance, phenomenological modification of the anti-trapping current. So this is the form that has this anti-trapping current. It's just an additional flux that you're adding in your, say, diffusion equation to compensate for the solute trapping numerically induced. And it has the solute jump at the interface, the interface width, the normal to the interface given by the gradient of the phase field, and the rate of solidification here, the change of your phase field versus time. And the typical standard version has a constant here. And the idea by two groups of authors actually is just, let's use this term that was initially used to correct anti-trapping to actually make it, allow it to trap some solute, but so in an amount that we can actually control to some extent. So the first group, Pinoma and Provatas, proposed this function, right, to change this coefficient here by a function of the phase field. Then there's another group, Kavuzi and Asli Zahim, that proposed another function that they that is slightly more complex, but they claim to be more, show better convergence. And then you're adding additional parameters here, like this parameter A, that you can fit to match the evolution of your partition coefficient with velocity to some model that you want to match. For instance, the classical continuous growth model by Aziz, that I've shown, and Charland has shown also before. And so you see that at the onset of solute trapping, you start having a deviation of your partition coefficient with velocity. It will deviate at some point. So this is a pragmatic extension. It starts showing some solute trapping to the extent that you want to have it, but it's limited to values close to the onset of solute trapping. Still, it's a very pragmatic extension that requires very little change versus the quantitative models that we already have. And then there's another approach that is quite promising, that is this finite interface dissipation model. I'm not getting into the details, but essentially you have two solute fields, one in the solid, one in the liquid, and those two fields are connected by a kinetic kinetic equation that introduces an additional parameter that is a permeability. So a term that in the equation relates to a permeability of solute through the interface. It's a bit hard to define how to actually calculate it. So it's mostly used as a calibrating parameter. And then you have this, thin interface asymptotics that remains to be done for this type of models. And you have a couple of alternate versions that try to tackle this problem of permeability, for instance, using a relaxation of the partition coefficient or extremal principles in non-equilibrium thermodynamics. But essentially, when you look at solute segregation coefficient versus velocity, this model is capable of catching the solute trapping up to, almost complete solute trapping. So, all right, very well. Now, where do we get these parameters from? You can get some, the parameters remain very scarce in the literature to find. So some of them you can do atomistics. For kinetic coefficient, it works quite well. Look at velocity versus undercooling. It works well to the extent that you can even grasp the difference with respect to orientation of the interface, so the anisotropy of this parameter. For solute trapping, well, it's a little harder. I'll let you be the judge to whether or not there's a trend in this cloud of points. And one of the challenges in these MD simulations is that there's a lack of reliable potentials at the melting temperature. And just so you know, this group of authors is actually some of the top groups in developing such reliable potentials, and this is the type of data they came up with. So still challenging, I would say. Or you can calibrate with these other phase field models that I've discussed in the beginning. that are actually quantitative as long as you have an interface width that remains small. And then you can calibrate your permeability as a function of your diffuse interface width to, calibrate, for instance, the permeability. Okay. So here's the, midway conclusions. So far, so a reference quantitative model for rapid solidification is still to emerge. I had written previously still to be developed, but perhaps it's one of the developed ones that already exist, but it hasn't really emerged yet as being the solution of choice. So still discussed and to be discussed, I think. So there are some phenomenological models with some parameters to calibrate, though, that we can use. However, it's important to remember that fusion-based metal AM may not systematically be rapid solidification. So in some cases, we may need this type of models. In other cases, the equilibrium with some tweaking can be used. So that was about rapid solidification and phase field background. Now let's look at, I'll do a little review of what's been done in the literature in terms of multi-scale modeling of microstructure formation in additive manufacturing, and I'll focus on selective laser melting, so powder bed fusion. So one of the first studies that kind of caught my eye back then was by the folks in the national labs, and that looks very nice. They have some experiments in Cornell 718. They do some CalFAD calculation, some phase field, and some finite element simulation, of the thermal field. So it's great. You get the the profile of the melt pool, but if you look deeper into that study, there's a couple of things missing. For instance, these are essentially for independent study. They just do a CalFAD calculation using a Gulliver Shile. Okay, they do a thermal finite element simulation on one side, and then they do a separate with other parameters on a binary nickel 4% niobium phase field calculation with parameters that are perhaps not that converged. Let's just see. So, I mean, this is totally going in the right direction of trying to combine models together, but however, the linking is not really existing there. We're looking at a single crystal at a very small scale, and the model used here is not for rapid solidification. So what else is there out there? You have another study by the folks in Access Aachen, where they essentially looked at, they did some experiments, they saw some cellular microstructure, and they used micres to model solidification at this time of the multi-component alloy, right? At some, almost relevant, let's say, conditions. So you see the velocity is a little low and the gradient is probably okay for some processes, but perhaps a little low too. But still, they can get some, decent, reasonably looking microstructure with a reasonable length scale, and they're in 3D, but they still remain, single crystals. Now let me jump to something that is not additive manufacturing, but something that is very much rapid solidification. That is these DTEM experiments, these dynamic TM experiments. And that's what Pinoma and Provatas have used to actually use their model, right? The model that changes the anti-trapping current term. And they use a little thermal model for this melt pool. So just to remind you, the experiment, you have a thin TEM layer, you zap it with a laser, you have an elliptical melt pool, and it's very thin, so it cools very fast, so it shrinks very fast towards the center here. And they use phase field models, this time using their, a polycrystalline implementation at relevant length and time scale, and using the rapid solidification or quasi-rapid solidification, as it's called in their paper, because it's just the onset of rapid solidification. And they find reasonable results when you compare the TEM, grain maps with their model. However, as they mentioned in their paper, they do have some scale limitations in terms of computational time and in terms of number of grains, because they're using a multi-phase field. So there's one order of parameter per grain. So in terms of memory, that can get extremely draining, extremely fast. And now, what is probably to date the one of the state-of-the-art simulation combining different models is the study from the thesis of Kubra Karayagis at Texas A&M, where they do a phase field finite element simulation of the melt pool. They take selective evaporation of elements into account. They have a fancy model for finite elements of the melt pool. And then they actually use the finite interface dissipation model for rapid solidification this time to calculate within little domains, still reduced in size, but some small domains, to see what type of microstructure that would lead to. And they also compare to experiments, which is appreciable. For instance, in the case that they have planar, they calibrate somewhat the parameters that they're missing, like the permeability, to look at that. And two things that stand out from the study to me is something that was already mentioned by Charles-André. That is the evolution of the growth rate and the temperature gradient within the melt pool. So if you go from the tail to the bottom here, you see that the growth rates for the scan speed of 1 meter per second, it goes from 1 meter per second, but it drops to 0 at the bottom of the melt pool. And the temperature gradient evolves like this too. So you may very well be in rapid solidification regime at the tail, but for 90% of your melt pool be in non-rapid solidification regime. And that's something that they see in these simulations here, that they actually have a planar front here that restabilizes and microstructure developing at the bottom. So whether or not the transition to planar is quantitative, I mean, there's still some work there, but that's most definitely going in the right direction. And another takeaway from that paper is that the authors conclude, okay, but we don't know what to take for this permeability coefficient. Look, we change it, by orders of magnitude because we don't really have a guideline about how to choose it, and we get, notably different partition coefficient versus growth rate. So, okay, that's pretty much what's out there. Now let me comment on why, all these models are limited in scale. Why do we have these, micrometer square simulations? Why cannot we go higher? And that is, and that relates to, are phase field simulation feasible at melt pool scale? Can we do that? Well, it relates to the link between the growth dynamics of the dendrite and its morphology. Essentially, if you want to have an accurate description of the growth kinetics of your dendrite tip, you need to have an accurate description of its morphology. So it's dendrite tip curvature that's in the, that decreases when the velocity increases. So it can get, almost nanometric. In the case of AM, you need to have a grid spacing much smaller than your dendrite tip radius. And that is extremely constraining in terms of, discretization that you need. And I have those two examples here that show some relevant quantity at steady state, like the tip solute supersaturation or the tip radius. As you increase the diffuse interface width, that scales like the grid spacing. And if you go up to a certain point, you remain, fairly converged. But as you go up, you start diverging and having results that are not reliable anymore. And that was true in, that is not 2014. Perhaps I messed up something with the reference. I think it was 2004. There should be a 0 here. So that was true on one core at this time, and that is still true on 500 GPUs in 2015. So that's a model feature. That's not something that is numerical. And in rapid solidification, you add an extra constraint that is the diffusion length. So you need enough grid point in your diffusion length that gets very narrow to be able to model quantitatively what is happening here. So extremely computationally challenging, and this is essentially why. Now let me illustrate one last example of something that's out there in the literature. In the case that you do not have, you don't want to model all the dendrite tips. And that's a study done by Peter Voorhees' group, that was published recently, where you have beautiful videos. And what they do here, they consider, okay, what if we want to model for an alloy and conditions that we know are already above absolute stability, beyond absolute stability? So we will have planar interface no matter what. We will have full solute trapping no matter what. So they don't even consider the solute field because it, complete solute trapping K equals 1. So in the end, you can have a phase field model that gives you a trace of the thermal history to some extent, but you can start playing with things like the anisotropy of your kinetic coefficient and things like that with such a model. But you will not have, the dendritic structure that you want to have and see inside. Okay, so now the last bit of my talk, now that we have a good idea of what's the, playing field like, and what are the limitations, let me show you some of the ongoing work. So once again, it's very much work in progress. We're putting the tools together, and we're trying to address some of the limitations out there. But of course, we'll also make some strong assumptions that will have their own limitations. So the idea is to combine computational thermodynamics, so essentially CalFAD, to deal with the aspect of multi-component alloy. What is the effect if I add a little bit, I don't know, a few percent or something else on, the processing, both at the macro scale and micro scale. We will combine macro scale thermomechanics using our finite element codes, something fairly similar to what you've done in a couple of things before. And we'll use phase field modeling at the micro scale to see what's the development within the melt pool. And then later on, when we have that all bundled up together nicely and validated with experiments, we'll throw that at our colleague Javier Segurado, who can do, microstructure, plasticity, crystalline plasticity simulation that calibrates very well with the experiments in terms of mechanical properties. So the approach for the temperature-dependent properties, we essentially determine temperature-dependent properties such as density, heat capacity, and transformation temperature as much as we can from CalFAD, and tabulated from the literature when we cannot do CalFAD, for instance, thermal conductivity. And we end up, here I represent 3 different alloys, even though most of the study is focused on Inconel 7.8, where you have enthalpy versus temperature. I could have shown density. We have graphs for different properties like that, where you see the melting and you see the evaporation, solid, liquid, gas. And from there, you can extract an effective heat capacity that you can throw into your finite element model, and some properties like transformation temperature that you can feed into your phase field model. So the CalFAD simulation that we do give us some key parameters to input into the other models. That's the idea here, and we use temperature-dependent properties. And then we use our in-house code that's called IRIS. Using this temperature-dependent property, we have a couple of thermomechanical solver. We do not take into account the hydrodynamics of the melt pool. So we consider 3 different states, powder, liquid, solid, and we just have a simple thresholding between, when it's going to get into a liquid state and then a dense solid, no defect yet. And we add mesh elements for each layer. We've implemented possibility to put an arbitrary path, different laser radius, power distribution, and we've have some analytical models that we get from the literature that extrapolate powder properties from the bulk, taking into account properties of the bulk, the gas, the mean powder diameter, the packing factor, the view factor, and so on. And then, so at this time, I'm only showing the thermal model, but we'll also have the mechanics that are implemented and that we're working out some of the kinks right now. And we'll then use this heat profile to put into the phase field modeling. So just some, cute illustration of where we get at with this thermal model in terms of building a part, and we can also put arbitrary path, so we can write whatever we want in there. So that's the typical simulation that we have from our finite element simulations. Then for the phase field modeling, the last part of the model, we have implemented a multi-GPU implementation. As I've mentioned already, computation is a large bottleneck, a stringent bottleneck. So we have a massively parallelized simulation that scales fairly well with the number of GPUs that you use, right? Compared to an already parallelized single GPU code here, almost linear scaling. At first, we consider two-dimensional slices within the finite element model. First, for moderate growth velocities, so equilibrium at the interface, a simplified, single order parameter polycrystalline model that saves memory and speed quite a lot. And then we use elliptical approximation to the melt pool, but we fit these shapes to the actual shape that we get from the finite element. And we use a phenomenological nucleation algorithm that introduces some calibration parameters that we still need to work out. And at first we redid those simulations that are in the literature for nickel 5% niobium, figuring out that here you have your convergence analysis, figuring out that the parameters that we're using in the literature were kind of off in terms of convergence. So we fix that and use smaller parameters. And here are the typical results that we have. So at this point, they're mostly cartoon illustration of where we want to get. They're not yet completely at scale, even though they're using reasonable binary proxy for Inconel, velocity that start being in the right range, even though we're also exploring larger ones, and reasonable. So pay attention, 5 nanometer is the scale that we need for the grid. And here I'm showing the grain map that results from these 2D simulations and the composition map that you get out of that, where you can see here you have we're following the melt pool in space traveling towards the right, and we can see without nucleation, and then it's still very qualitative, but we have calibration parameters for the nucleation that can allow us to have different type of grain structure here. And basically, that should allow us, once we have calibrated the things that we need to calibrate properly, to interrogate things within the grain, such as the dendritic spacings that you see clearly here on the composition map, the segregation map of solute within the grain and between the grain, and hopefully to provide some useful information to upscale towards larger models like the one Charles-André was showing previously. And so just to summarize briefly the advantages and limitation, we do some coupling, linking, chaining, if you will, between CalFad, phase field, and finite element. We have a simple and efficient polycrystalline phase field for arbitrary temperature profile. It's still quantitative for limited velocity. And well, we have some limitations that I've already mentioned here, but all of these limitations are actually items on the to-do list, or at least most of them are. And that's the future. As I told you, it's very much work in progress. And now I'll just comment on a couple of perspectives because time is running out. But this is my very last slide. What's ongoing and what are the perspectives? So multiple extensions and calibrations of the model that relates to the limitation that I've mentioned throughout the talk. We're planning some experimental validation and model calibration. within the project that we're in right now with collaborators in the aeronautic industry, but also in-house experiment where we simplify down the experiment going to binary alloys, and this is the work by Clara Galera and Teresa and Javi Yorca are involved in this, and they're actually performing these experiments that should provide us some useful data to calibrate our models. And further down the way, when we're capable of extracting some statistically relevant descriptors for microstructure, we can throw that to Javier Segurado and his group, and he can predict, using digital microstructure, things like fatigue life and things like that. So that's about it. And I think that was more than enough given the time. Thank you for your attention. I hope I didn't go overboard too much. I'll be happy to take questions either now or later after the break if we don't have much time now. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Yes, indeed, we are a little bit short in time at the moment, and we have one more presentation. If there is a quick burning question, we can take it now. Otherwise, we move the question part to after the presentation from Anas.